Welcome to Not Suitable for Democracy. I'm your host, Nick, and this week I'm sharing 2 episodes just for you. Episode 50 will focus on the electability of Maine's Troy Jackson and Michigan's Dr. Abdul El-Sayed. Then episode 51 will focus on the online discourse, and this summer it's gotten pretty heated, and that will specifically focus on Bernie and the use of the word establishment. Well, we have a lot to talk about today. Let's jump into electability. But before we begin, I'd love to remind you that if you like what you hear and want to learn more, then make sure to subscribe to Not Suitable for Democracy on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube. Or you can follow along on Instagram and TikTok. I use the same handle for both, and you can follow at NSFD_pod. Now, back to the show. Electability. We hear this phrase all over the internet. We've heard it ever since 2016 and well before that. It's really a cudgel to really force people into a mindset of what seems as the logical choice, because this is how the establishment, the status quo, is able to retain power in these positions by forcing the electability conversation, which is generally a made-up phrase. It's the whole idea of like who the voter thinks is most electable. So I don't support the idea of electability. This is going to focus on countering that, okay? So when we talk about electability, we're going to showcase why we think these candidates, Maine's Troy Jackson and Michigan's Abdul El-Sayed, are the most electable in these respective races for the United States Senate. So starting in Maine with Troy Jackson, let's talk about who Troy Jackson even is. So Troy Jackson currently is on his way to become the nominee for the Democratic Party to represent Maine in the United States Senate. Now, Troy Jackson has a long history in politics and in union work. So Troy Jackson grew up in rural area of Maine, and his father was a logger working in the woods on intensive construction projects. And Troy Jackson followed in his father's footsteps. So he wound up graduating college and eventually went to work as a logger and even joined the union. So in doing this work, right, Troy Jackson put in like 80-hour work weeks working in the woods on these intense manual labor projects, all for loggers. Now, during his time as a logger, he was even organizing in protest, where there was a time when loggers would go across the border to Canada to get similar jobs. And pretty much, this would not only boost the Canadian economy and hurt the local Maine American economy. So because of this kind of workers were getting poached out of Maine to go to Canada, this was hurting the union. So by doing this, right, Troy Jackson and his fellow loggers actually put their bodies on the line to block people from going to Canada and force the conversation that Maine union workers who are loggers need better contracts. And they won. So this whole idea that Troy Jackson has been fighting for union workers since his earliest days, even before public office. He has a record, and it shows in his perspectives, especially now with progressive policy. So fast forward, now this is where the whole idea of purity politics comes into play. I'm not a proponent of purity politics. I really think we need to really level set and understand that while candidates want to strive for great ideals, we shouldn't let certain, let's say, flaws, disadvantages, certain outcomes, certain experiences shape our perspective to prevent us from voting or supporting them to then ultimately lose these consequential elections. I'm willing to forgive, and I'm willing to learn, and I'm willing to move forward. And I hope you are as well. So what I mean by that in this context with Troy Jackson is that when he first ran for office, he ran as a Republican. Now, at that point in time, the Republican Party was more favorable to loggers. And, that's just a shame on how his rural community was only seeing Republican leadership, but his own conservative upbringing brought him to that conclusion. And that was in, I believe, 1998. And he lost that election running in the Assembly, or the Legislature. Troy Jackson wound up running 2 years later as an independent, and he won. So learning from his mistake from running as a Republican, evolving as an independent, because at that point in time, he knew that was the best path forward to not necessarily organize with either party, but just on his own merit. And his neighbors, his family, and fellow voters supported him to win his first election. Then after that, he actually became a member of the Democratic Party because then in the early 2000s in Maine, that was the only party willing to allow work with unions. So if the Democratic Party was supporting the unions, then that gave Troy Jackson the faith he needed to become a member of the Democratic Party, and he's been a Democrat ever since. Now, part of his record includes actually voting against same-sex marriage in the Maine Legislature. And he's also voted against reproductive rights in the Maine Legislature. But since then, he has come across and saying that, his vote to deny same-sex couples the right to marry, he said that was his worst vote ever. So, hey, he's learned, he's come around, and I respect that. Same with reproductive rights. He knows that he champions women's rights now. He's evolved on his conservative religious upbringing. And fast forward, he is primed to meet this moment where we are right now in progressive politics, both with economic populism and with social progress. And now there's reports saying that, those who are not exactly fans of Troy Jackson, saying that, he was basically, aggressive or feisty, let's say, and rightfully so. For those of you who understand the context, right, the Democratic Party establishment was never fully kind to union laborers and never fully kind to union policy. So it makes sense that Troy Jackson, who was also the Senate president for like 6 years, really did have a good grasp on local policy, union labor, and the actual perspective to inform those decisions. So because of that, right, he's been a Democrat, long time standing, a lot of political history, but also doing the work. So here we are now where the state of Maine has to elect or has to nominate their new nominee. So Troy Jackson ran for governor based on his past record I just described, and he lost. Now, in Maine, they have ranked choice voting, and through a deal that actually Graham Plattner actually really was integral in, getting the top 3 candidates to really support each other, much like how Mayor Mamdani and Brad Lander at the time cross-endorsed each other to support the progressive movement in our ranked choice voting municipal elections here in New York City. So using that same camaraderie and solidarity, it turns out that Troy Jackson was very close to winning, but ultimately lost after all the votes of ranked choice voting were counted in Maine. And that's okay, because now Graham Plattner helped to orchestrate and amplify the message that Troy Jackson would be the most likely to align with his platform and his policies. And listen, Graham Plattner ran a phenomenal campaign. I will not take that away from him. And he was able to use that political capital to let the voters of Maine know that Troy Jackson is the real deal. And how do we know that it actually paid off? Well, if you look at the caucus process, where at each caucus, the voters of Maine would have to determine how many delegates are sent to the Maine Democratic Party convention. And that's where, based on how many delegates there are, they would then nominate the new nominee. So there are 500 delegates from all the counties around Maine, and there's 100, basically super delegates, that are from the Maine Democratic Party. And the super delegates in this case is the State Democratic Committee, which we have one here in New York. At least in the Maine Democratic Party, there's 500 delegates, but 100 state committee members. So out of the 500 delegates that were up for grabs across the county, Troy Jackson has secured 481 out of 500. So an overwhelming majority of delegates from the county level, are going to that convention to nominate him as the nominee. So that being said, he is very likely to become the nominee for United States Senate, and he is most likely to take down Susan Collins. Why do I say that? Well, number one, we know the polls are in his favor. The polls have shown that they are very receptive to Troy Jackson. He does have strong grassroots organizing support already built in from his years as a logger, years as a union organizer, and years in the state legislature. Graham Plattner never had a legislative record, but Troy Jackson does. But more importantly, the fact that we've seen Troy Jackson's, career trajectory evolve, starting as a Republican to independent to Democrat to conservative Democrat and now to progressive Democrat. That's the kind of change I like to see, and I trust Troy Jackson. The fact that he is running on a platform so progressive that if you look at his website, he wants to tax the rich and have corporations pay their fair share, fight for Medicare for all, pass protections for LGBTQI plus folks. He wants to dismantle and abolish ICE. He has so many great progressive policy ideas that we can actually implement while bolstering the progressive movement in the United States Senate and the grassroots movement that will carry more victories to people in the House and state legislatures around the country. So I strongly encourage you, if you're in Maine, please, please, please vote for Troy Jackson when he becomes the Democratic nominee on Saturday, July 25th, when the majority of delegates have already said they're going to support him. 481 out of 500, even that extra 100 from their state committee cannot stop Troy Jackson. And most likely, there's probably going to be some of those 100 that vote for him as well. So, that being said, I think Troy Jackson can fundraise. I think he has a good message. I think he has a strong platform. And while I think he might not be the most, sharp communicator like Graham Plattner was, I do think Troy Jackson can work on that, meet people at town halls, organize around the state, and ultimately defeat Susan Collins in November.